Hello everybody, thank you very much for joining today. I hope that you can all hear me. So my name is Lucy Gardner and I am the Hub Coordinator for the GBV Hub of the Joint Learning Initiative. Thank you so much for joining, and I'm really looking forward to having some really good discussion and hearing these findings. And before we start, I just wanted to remind you all that we are recording this webinar so that those who weren't able to join are able to listen back, and also for you to listen back should you want to. If you can just make sure that your microphones are muted, and we'd love you to be thinking about questions as we go through this presentation. Please type them in the chat that we have. And if they're urgent questions that you need clarification on as we're going through, I'll interject the speaker. But otherwise, we will respond to the questions at the end of the presentation. You should be able to see the presentation slides in here so that you can follow through. So we're going to present the findings from a 3 years project on preventing violence against women and girls in the DRC. And the aim of this webinar is not only to present these findings from the project, but to have a broader discussion on the research and the implications of the findings for GBV work and also faith-based GBV work. So we welcome your questions, reflections and thoughts as we go through. So speaking today, I have with me Elena Bezzolato and Dr. Elisabet le Roux. Elena is the Programme Coordinator for SGBV in humanitarian contexts at Tearfund and has been coordinating the last 12 months of the project's implementation together with Tearfund DRC and the local partner HealAfrica. And Dr. Elisabet le Roux is Research Director in the Unit for Religion and Development Research at Stellenbosch University in South Africa and has been leading the research component for this project. So it's my delight to introduce both of these ladies to you today, and I'll hand over now to Elena, who will give us an overview of the intervention. Thank you, Elena.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining us today. So I will give you a bit of context on the project, on the area of intervention, on the intervention design, to facilitate the understanding on and locate what we've been doing. But as Lucy said, the aim is to focus on the results and the implication of the results, to kind of have your thoughts and facilitate the discussion, so it won't be too long. If we can move back one slide, please. Thank you. So the intervention is a 3 years intervention funded by the Department for International Development for the UK government in the framework of a global programme called VAWG to Prevent Violence Against Women and Girls. The funds managed by the South African Medical Research Council, and you can find all the information on the global programme at the website indicated in the slide. But I'll speak a bit more around the specific project, so we can move to the next, please. So the project title is Engaging with Faith Groups to Prevent Violence Against Women and Girls in Conflict-Affected Communities, and has been involving 15 communities in the northeast of Democratic Republic of Congo in the Ituri province. The implementation itself of the project has been for 28 months, and our local partner, implementing partner, has been the Congolese organization HealAfrica, and as said, Stellenbosch University has been our partner for the research component. So the What Works global program has been testing different approaches and different implementation projects around the world, but all of them had a strong research component to kind of have build evidence around what works in the field of preventing violence against women and girls. So in this, this is the framework where this project has been going on. If we can move to the next slide, I'll just give you briefly an idea on the context. So for those who are not familiar with DRC, this is a very a context which has been interested by many years of war, and the violence is still ongoing in many parts of the country, with many armed groups still affecting the life of communities. There's a very high level of gender inequality and gender-based violence, with around 1.8 million women estimated having suffered sexual violence at some point of their life. And I will focus a bit more on the area of the implementations, and as we said, the northeast of the country. The data you can see are from our baseline survey. So these are a bit of an idea, to give you an idea on the context. So it's a context with a high prevalence of intimate partner violence, as well as non-partner sexual violence. So a bit of rebalancing the narrative around conflict-related violence, which, as we know, has a high prevalence of non-partner sexual violence committed by armed groups, but as well as violence committed by other unknown people. But you can see the high prevalence as well of intimate partner violence. Basically the whole of the communities, 95%, identify with the faith group, which gives us an idea of the potential that faith has in this area. And most of the people think that faith groups should have a role in tackling gender-based violence, though only a small percentage of survivors actually experience some kind of support in their own communities. And as you can see, the attitudes and the beliefs around gender equality quite difficult. So with a very high belief that men are superior to women, and despite the influence of faith, only around half of them believing that faith has something to say around gender equality in terms of changing the narrative. So just to give you an idea of the context we are working with. It has to be said as well that these communities are highly isolated, as well as constantly affected by local conflicts and local fighting. So with difficult access, and that Lisa will explain later how that affected as well the research side and the implementation as well. You can imagine during the whole implementation, quite a long time, the different clashes and the difficulties of access affected and kind of had an impact on what we could actually do and how the research could have been developed during the time. Next slide. So our theory of change moves from the idea that the intervention activities, which I will explain in a bit, would have led to three main impact outcomes. So the idea we wanted to achieve a violence-free environment for men and women. So in the space of the relationship, as we've seen, the high prevalence of intimate partner violence, and a transformation of social norms around VAWG for what concerns the acceptance of violence. So no violence not accepted anymore in the communities of the intervention, and also a shift around stigma for survivors and the possibility for survivors to access help. So these are the kind of main aim. We can move to the next one. And just to give you an idea of the intervention itself, so our main approach is called Transforming Masculinities, which work with faith leaders to equip them and to train them in terms of addressing violence in their communities, engaging with their own communities to become on one side to speak out against violence, but also to provide support to survivors. So you can find on our website all our approaches and the material around that. So in the specific of this project, the intervention has been engaging with 75 faith leaders, 30 gender champions, so members of the community that are somehow have a leadership position or a position of influence in the community. And we've been training 15 community action groups, so one for each community, to kind of provide information and support to survivors, to access services, basically to kind of overcome the difficulties of access to public services in the area, and kind of become a kind of first point of first help or first access point for survivors to kind of seek help. So as you can see, we've been engaging key community actors, and we've been training and equipping them in a number of ways with different trainings around the root causes of violence against women and girls and the theology as well. We provided tools and Bible studies, but also we've been working with mixed communities, so Christian and Muslim. So we've been developing together with the communities themselves a different perspective on the theology from other faith as well, on how, so what faith can say to improve and to facilitate gender equality instead of being a space for other trainings involved the better understanding of gender equality, as said, and the support to survivor. So with basic counselling and mediation, as well as basic skill for faith leaders and community leaders to kind of help survivors and become like this first aid space. The community leaders have been asked then to lead actions in their communities, mainly becoming role models, and then with sharing information, organizing community dialogues, which are weekly sessions to kind of engage the communities in conversations around what are the gender roles, what is violence, how does that look like in the context, and then to facilitate support for survivors, as said. A key part of the intervention has been the monitoring and the mentoring of these community actors to make sure that the transformation happened in first place with them before transmitting, the notions and the new understanding around gender equality to the communities, but mainly to become, as said, role models for the rest of the communities. We can move on, and I will pass to Lisa to explain a bit more the research component of the intervention.
Thanks, Elena. Okay, so the research included a quantitative and a qualitative component, so over the period of 3 years. I was research lead in the entirety, but Gamos, which is a UK-based consultancy, was responsible for conducting the baseline and inline quant surveys. And as part of the What Works grant, so the bigger grant that Tearfund was part of, they were assigned technical advisors, and especially in the last year of this project, we received considerable research support from our technical advisor, and that was really helpful, especially in the light of some difficulties that we had with the conflict breaking out again. So I'm first going to give you an overview of the quant research and then the qual. So the quant, it took the form of 2 community surveys. So the intervention was conducted in 15 communities, 5 each, and in 3 different health areas. So like Elena said, it's really an incredibly rural part of the DRC. So it's very isolated, conflict affected, very little state infrastructure or resources, and very little NGO or UN presence as well. which is one of the reasons why it was chosen, that it was not oversaturated. So at both baseline and endline, data was collected from male and female members of randomly selected households in the 15 villages where the intervention was being implemented. So at baseline, so this happened before the intervention was launched, the aim was to sample 800 households, 400 male interviews and 400 female. So then a total of 769 interviews were conducted with 400 women and 369 men. So then at endline, 28 months later, the aim was to increase the sample by about 50%. So 599 men were sampled and 619 women. And it was again equally split between the 3 health areas. Now, at both baseline and endline, a key eligibility criteria was that all respondents must be 18 years or older. However, at baseline, 18 respondents, and at endline, 20 respondents were younger than 18. Various reasons for this, but sometimes because there wasn't an older household member present. So the baseline data was collected in June and July of 2015, and then the endline happened end of last year, November and December. And the interviews were conducted by female and male enumerators, and they used tablets. And then because a section of the survey was quite sensitive, it was related to experiences of violence and perpetration of violence. Those sections were self-administered. So the enumerator would explain how to use the tablet and then actually hand it over to the male or female respondent. And then in the cases where they couldn't read or were uncomfortable reading themselves, there was like a demonstration question of pressing yes or no, and then the enumerator would read the question, hand the tablet over, look away, and then the participant would click yes or no, and then they'd move on to the next question. So if we look at the qual, so the qualitative research, the biggest component of the qual was a panel study. So a panel study is a qualitative longitudinal design. So you collect data from the same sample, the same people at several points during the duration of the project. So the panel study was conducted with faith leaders and gender champions. So those two groups were directly trained by Tearfund and HealAfrica. So a number of faith leaders and a number of these gender champions were selected to be part of the panel. And they, at regular interviews, they were at regular intervals, they were individually interviewed and part of focus groups. So in total, 4 panel visits were conducted at approximately 8-month intervals. And they started before the intervention, so in July 2015, and the last one was conducted in August of 2017. So we had a bit of a problem with attrition with these panel studies. So the faith leader panel was originally meant to consist of 20 faith leaders. And we actually started with a bigger group, with the first panel with 24 to control for attrition. But actually by the 4th panel study, only 15 remained. And with the gender champions, there was supposed to be 10. We started with 14 to control for attrition, but we ended with 6. So we tried to avoid attrition, but clearly it didn't work. A number of possible reasons exist for the panel attrition. So common to such unstable areas, people just moved around and moved away, and one panel member died. But it is still quite a high number, and we don't quite understand why. So the panel study was conducted by an on-site Congolese research assistant, and she did every single panel study, every interview, every focus group. So this was quite great because it allowed for the development of trust and rapport and for the development of all her skills. And you could actually really see that in the quality of the transcripts of the interviews as the study progressed. And the interviews were then conducted in French or Kiswahili. And then, so that's the qual, that's the quant. And then in terms of M&E, At the first training that the faith leaders and gender champions received, they completed a self-discovery tool, so that was other data. And then the on-site project manager met with the faith leaders, with all the faith leaders and all the gender champions, every 2 to 4 weeks, and then would help them complete the self-monitoring tool, just in terms of what activities they've been doing and where, and what kind of content. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Just to reflect briefly on the research challenges, and for those of you who have conducted research in similar settings, I think you'll be very used to these kind of challenges. Now, Tearfund chose the site intentionally to see how this kind of intervention would work in an isolated, fragile setting. So that was a key part about looking at VAWG interventions in unstable settings. But this has, of course, challenged the research process, so communication was difficult. The research team was spread all over the world, different languages were spoken. With this research site, very little cell phone reception in many settings. The project staff and research assistant had to travel considerable distance to get to internet, and that internet wasn't even strong enough to carry Skype. So these are like typical issues, but it really does complicate the research process compared to doing it in, say, Cape Town or Lusaka. And then transcription and translation of the qual data, especially, it was a constant headache because these languages aren't widely spoken. There aren't many people transcribing and translating with these languages. So, but you're so dependent on good quality transcripts. So that was a challenge. Then one also faces challenges if you're part of a bigger grant. So this What Works grant, there are so many benefits to it, and I will be speaking about that or referring to that a bit later. But the monitoring and reporting frameworks for such a bigger grant, it changes at least once a year, and it's just so many forms and tick boxes and things. So without getting into details, and again, recognizing there are many positives, it does make the research process very complicated and messy if there's so many people who actually have a say in what you're doing and how you're doing it. And you're not as quickly responsive to contextual changes and challenges as you can usually be. And then, like I refer to the reality of being in a conflict-affected area. Now, this has impacted our research most directly with a qualitative work. Now, crucial to the research design was an endline qualitative research visit after the quant has been completed, after we've analyzed the data, so that we have a chance to investigate in more depth any issues that are raised that we're not quite understanding from the data. So this would have been with faith leaders, with gender champions, but with community members, those exposed and those not exposed to the intervention. But then conflict started again, just after we completed the quant baseline. And in the end, we had to cancel all endline visits, endline qual visits. So this has really impacted our research, for there are a few things that we are now left not understanding. But again, this is the reality of doing an intervention and research in such a setting. And then lastly, and Elena also referred to this, you have challenges when you do a longitudinal study. So it is so great that this, really looked at the intervention over a period of time. And I think it's a big gap in faith-based research that is being addressed. But you do face other challenges than you would if you just did a once-off evaluation. So staff leave, people move around, conflicts breaks out, elections get moved around. So it's definitely easier to do a once-off evaluation. But this is par for course if you want to do longitudinal research. But again, that was a challenge. I'm I'm going to hand over now to Elena, who is going to just give you a brief overview of the key findings from the research.
Thank you. So you can see quite nicely graphically here the kind of overall findings from the quantitative endline survey, and some of them are backed up by the panel endline as well, the kind of the final analysis on the panel interviews that Liz explained. So good news as per our theory of change, we have seen, we can say we have seen a reduction of intimate partner violence and a shift in the harmful social norm that we wanted to see, that we assumed would have happened thanks to the intervention run in the area. So we grouped them in 5 main direction, let's say. So the data we have, as Lisa said, open to further questions, and we haven't been able to kind of counter-check with the qualitative endline. Some things are we still need to better understand. We haven't finalized the report yet, but we're hoping to finalize that really soon. So let's say I'm giving you the direction of what we're seeing more than very detailed findings at this stage, but we really hope that can kind of generate a discussion and questions from you. So we've seen reduction of violent behaviors, both in intimate partner violence and non-partner sexual violence. With the reduction, the data shows around 40% of IPV, both reported by men perpetrators and reported by women survivors or victims. So this gives us a bit of confidence that this number has some validity. Also, the non-partner sexual violence decreased quite a lot. As said, we still need to understand how much we can attribute this to the intervention, but this is definitely good news for the communities and the people involved. We then have seen, as said, a shift in the social norms around masculinity and around gender equality, with a change in the beliefs that, as we said at the beginning, were really unequal. We've seen now a change towards a better understanding of gender equality and beliefs, at least self-expressed beliefs of around a better, a more equal situation for men and women in a different way, reported from men and women, and it is a space that opens to kind of discussion and a better understanding in the future, possibly. Another shift around the acceptance of violence, as we expected. We studied from our theory of change, with justification of violence overall and specific elements and attitudes that can justify violence towards men and women from both sides, from men perpetrating and from women suffering as well. The fourth kind of big change we've seen is around the stigma for survivors and the support that survivors can receive in the communities. So with the reduction of both internal and external stigma, so the kind of internalized shame and sense of guilt that survivors feel, but also all the attitudes from the wider community, the families and the partners, in kind of blaming the survivors or kind of not allowing survivors to seek help outside. The fifth element that we want to kind of highlight is the fact that faith leaders have actually become change agents, and survivors actually look for help towards them, and they've become a space speaking out against violence and a safer space, at least, for survivors. This has an impact not only on the faith group themselves, but on the wider communities, that you can see from the data in the last column. A wider percentage of the communities, even if not directly related with faith groups, has been affected. And these again open up to questions on why we've seen this. But this is definitely something that it's a positive result we want to kind of highlight and discuss around. All these findings are somehow backed up by the panel, as well. As I said, all the faith leaders and the gender champions part of the panels have been self-reporting these changes in their communities around behaviors and around norms and beliefs, and they definitely reporting a personal change on themselves and better attitudes, but also wider change in the communities and a better environment for survivors to look for help. These opens as well to questions. We've seen differences, obviously, in how gender equality was understood and internalized. We have a big question around the difference of changes between men and women. We still have to understand a number of issues around how the division of labor in the household changed, how the economic side of inequality has been impacted. So a number of questions are still open. Yeah, so I'm going to hand over again to Lisa to kind of dig a bit more into the implication of the findings that we've just seen.
Thank you, Elena. So I think maybe just to summarize from these findings that Elena has alluded to, I almost think she didn't sound positive enough. If we really summarize, we found a significant decline in all aspects of IPV at endline in comparison to baseline. We found significantly more equitable gender attitudes at endline. We found that working with faith leaders and faith communities as an entry point into community is a strategic approach. So there really has been questions that all of us as a faith-based GBV practice and research community, things that we've been wondering about and lacking evidence for. It's been tremendous findings from this research. But I'm going to, and I want to encourage you now within the next month or so, the endline quant report will come out. The qual is already out, I think. There will be policy briefs, there will be journal articles coming out to really take a look at it, and I'm sure JLI will share it. If we go to the next slide, please. I just want to discuss a couple of things that stand out for me about this research in terms of its broader implications for working on ending violence against women and girls, for our understanding of faith-based engagement on VAWG, on violence against women and girls, and for VAWG research in general. So first off, this is one of the few interventions that have had a baseline and endline evaluation done by external consultants, because there was money to do it. And that just makes what has been learned through the intervention so much more robust and marketable, if I can use a word like that. And it greatly helps that this has been part of the What Works program, for which there really is an international platform. And the research has benefited from the expertise and support of world leaders in VAWG research. So I really would encourage all of you that should there be a What Works 2 and noises are being made that there could be, to apply with possible interventions. So yes, the research is from a mainstream space, if I can call it that. It wasn't this little separate faith-based groupie on the side, but and being part of that mainstream space has really helped with how the research findings communicates and is being communicated. And And I think it also impacted how the research was done. So it was held up to international standards around, that secular, and I quote, secular VAWG research. And it was interpreted in relation to VAWG research in general. And again, not as some special faith-based research endeavor. And I really think this is how and where we need to be doing research. So not constantly claiming faith's uniqueness, and rather, being very intentional about putting faith-based programming through the same rigorous evaluation processes. And then something that has been really helpful in helping us understand how faith-based engagement works is with a quant endline, we really analyzed intervention outcomes, not only in relation to intervention exposure, but also to faith engagement. So looking at if a person is very involved, so they have some kind of possession or responsibility within a church or mosque, like passively engaged, they attend services, little engaged, so they go in Easter and Christmas, or no engagement, and constantly the intervention outcomes and changes, so reduction in IPV, change in attitudes, was measured also in relation to levels of faith engagement. And that has really helped us to see how the intervention impact is being influenced by the level of faith engagement. So I really want to encourage you to include this variable in your studies. Because the research has been powerful by doing this and showing how faith leaders and faith communities are a strategic entry point into communities, that what is being done by faith leaders don't only impact their faith communities, but the community in general. We still don't quite understand causality. So in the broader What Works programming across the board, we've been seeing that positive changes in communities in general, not just with the targeted beneficiaries. And across the board, we don't quite know how to explain it, but and we saw it in the DRC as well. This overall positive impact on the community. It should be noted that we need to do more research on IPV reduction in relation to faith engagement. So it really has been incredible IPV reduction in this community. But the experiences or perpetration of IPV that was reported at endline does not quite track with exposure to the intervention. So in other words, whether a person was directly exposed to the intervention activity or if they had no clue about it, it did not impact the decline in IPV experience of perpetration. It was lower regardless of level of exposure. Now, while it's plausible that in this context where social norm change was sought, so in this community, the impact of the intervention on those exposed could have an impact on the behavior of the unexposed. So that's a plausible, and that's our hypothesis. Unfortunately, we couldn't do the endline qual to really look at this in more detail. So we're really bummed that it couldn't happen. But we're very confident, and our data shows that in this link between social norm change and faith engagement and project exposure. And that is really great. Lastly, I want to raise the issue of women's complicity. Elena briefly alluded to this. We first started picking up on this with the panel data by the year roundabout by the third panel visit with the faith leaders and gender champions. We could start comparing the data collected at the different points that we would see with the women leaders, women faith leaders and women gender champions, less gender equitable attitudes and less change. So where they were consistently holding attitudes and beliefs and self-reported responses to VAWG survivors that support the dominant position of men and led to VAWG victims being stigmatized and blamed. So it's paradoxical, but we kept on seeing this. And then at the endline quant, we again saw that in certain cases, women were more likely to continue supporting gender inequitable attitudes at endline. So, for example, with the statement, is it manly for a man to beat his wife? There was significant reduction by endline in the agreement by men, but no corresponding significant reduction amongst women. So this is actually something that I've been consistently picking up in various studies and evaluations that I've been doing in the past 5 years or so. And I think it's something that we should be paying more attention to, really looking at this issue specifically. For the purpose of this webinar, I think it's enough to say that I think we need to think about how we structure our intervention programming. It might be that our interventions are so targeted at masculinities in men and on their understanding of gender relations that we're not adequately engaging with why and how women are actually also contributing to gender inequality and violence. So just to flag that issue. I think, and I'm out of time, so that's it from my side, but I really want to encourage you to take a look at the data as it's coming out, because it really does make for interesting reading, and I think it can impact all of our programming and for those of us who do research in how we look at doing research on this issue. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Lisa, and thank you, Elena, as well. We're going to move into a time of questions now. We've got about just over 10 minutes for that. And I can see that we have got a question from Terry. Thank you for this important work and for the webinar. Sadly, I must leave the webinar. Thank you, Terry. It wasn't a question, but just thank you. I look forward to reading the report. Women's complicities, no surprise, and yes, interventions are needed here. Positive feminities as well as positive masculinities. Huge thanks. Thank you very much, Terry. If there are any questions, we'd welcome them. I don't know if there are any responses to that.
Hello.
Hi there.
Hi, this is Sylvia Adebajo from Population Council Nigeria.
Great to have you with us.
Thank you, and congratulations to the team and the great presentation. It was clear and succinct. Just a quick question. For sustainability, that's 2 years down the line, what do you foresee will be the results, to the various outcomes of this project? So if we were to go back 2 years later to evaluate this project, what do you see would be the likely outcomes?
Elena, I'm going to jump in here from a research perspective. The first part of your question, my sound went out, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I heard like, what do I expect to see 2 years from now if we go back? I think you're raising such an important issue, and that's the issue. That's the fact that we rarely look at the sustainability of the impact of our interventions, and I realize this is related to funding. So, you might get funding to do an end line, but you don't get funding to go back 2 years later to see if the impact is still holding. So it's actually because there is almost no research around the sustainability of faith-based impact on GBV. I don't have anything else to go on, almost, to say it that way. But if you look at the theory of change of Tearfund's intervention, it is premised on this idea of faith leaders staying put in their community, and in terms of what we've been seeing, I would expect. I think that we won't go back to where it was at baseline, because of the presence of faith leaders and really the training and education and I think private, almost moral, or that sounds very patronizing, development that they were part of. The flip side being, the community is wrecked by conflict now again. So with the displacement, that would again challenge it, actually. I'm sounding so negative. It was actually not meant to be negative.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. Yeah, I think I wouldn't add much on that. I mean, I think as faith-based organization, we kind of have a taste of what working with faith leaders mean in terms of long-term presence, and what does that mean that once a change has kind of started, then we can hopefully have a bit of, kind of have an idea on the sustainability of that change, and that we kind of probably have to factor some backlashes, and you know, obviously, and as Lisa said, we know that this area is affected by a lot of displacement all the time. We've seen that even during the project. So we kind of expect that to kind of get an influence on the long-term sustainability of these the results. But there is an example that came from the area. So as Liz explained, we couldn't do the qualitative end line because of new conflict, not exactly in the communities where we were working with, but just on outside, so kind of very few kilometers outside the area. So the communities which kind of cut our access, but the communities we were working with were actually fine in that moment. They received a lot of displays though. We had like external comments from other actors in the area, which we were not working specifically on that project, but coming out to us saying that the way that communities where we were working with were receiving the displays were absolutely different from before. They've been much more welcoming, and there has been kind of a more peaceful and welcoming way of taking other people in. So that doesn't necessarily mean that we've been, you know, somehow having had a role in this, but I think that we started move some aspects that kind of reflect and have a kind of a ripple effect on other aspects of social lives. So I would say there's hope that can be quite sustainable.
Great, thank you both of you. Are there any more questions that we can take before we come to a close? I don't see any movement. So I think unless anyone has any burning questions, we will come to a close there. If you do think of anything that you'd like to ask, then you can. Then Elena and Elisabeth's email addresses are in the slide notes, and I will just type them into this chat as well. But I just want to say thank you so much to both of you for presenting this work, and thank you to all of you who have come and listened to this webinar. And I hope that it's been informative, and hope that this discussion can continue. And just to highlight again that the report is coming, so look out for that. We'll be flagging that through the JLI GBV hub once that's been published. So thank you all, and take care. Thank you.